Hello and welcome to Talk Africa, this week focusing on the annual summit of the African Union. Well, the African leaders this week converged in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, to assess progress in goals and chart the future. But peace and security remain at the core of the challenges facing the African Union. Terrorism, in particular the Boko Haram insurgency and the threat of Al-Shabaab, has introduced a new and complex dimension to this challenge. Now, according to the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, between 2009 and 2013, Boko Haram launched 801 attacks, killing 3,666 people. Now, in the same period, Al-Shabaab killed 2,149 people in 837 attacks. Now, over 200 girls abducted by Boko Haram from a school in northern Nigeria last April are still missing to date. Somalia's Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram share similar ideologies. Libya remains broken. South Sudan's ceasefire is delicate, and the DR Congo remains volatile. There is now hope, though, for South Sudan after rival SPLM factions signed a new IGAD-brokered peace deal in Arusha. Elsewhere, Ebola found room in an initial slow and uncoordinated response to devastate 3 West African nations. According to the World Health Organization, as of January the 26th, there were 21,924 cases of Ebola and 8,737 deaths. On the proposed intra-African trade, movement of goods and people across borders still remain a challenge. But there is now light at the end of the tunnel. The African Union and the Chinese government at the African Union Summit this week signed a continental transport memorandum of understanding that will open up Africa through high-speed railways, aviation, highways and industrialization infrastructure. The African Union Commission Chairperson Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Zhang Ning, the special envoy of the Chinese government and the Vice Foreign Minister of China, presided over the ceremony. Well, it was a full tray for African leaders gathered in Ethiopia. Issues touching on peace and security, justice and governance, infrastructure, development and women empowerment preoccupied the leaders there. Here's a look at some of the issues that dominated the African Union Summit's agenda.
It's an annual 2-day event meant to address the status of the continent, more so the underlying challenges. But even as it kicked off, it was clear the 24th summit theme on women and development would be beset by the challenges on the continent. From the constant instability in Libya and Mali, the Boko Haram menace in Nigeria, the South Sudan crisis plus Ebola, leaders were expected to discuss the economic recovery of countries affected by the virus.
Despite these challenges, and even as the downward gale force winds continue to buffet the world, Africa has been climbing a step at a time up the steep cliff towards peace, prosperity, and the restoration of the dignity of all our people.
The AU chairperson, who describes the situation in Nigeria as deeply horrifying, hopes the summit can renew collective efforts and response to the crisis. Already pressure is mounting to set up and deploy a multinational force. But so far Nigeria has rebuffed any foreign intervention from its neighbors, saying it can handle the crisis on its own.
I'm encouraged by progress towards the African standby force and the African capacity for crisis response. I urge you to make these mechanisms operational.
Since 2009, thousands have been killed and more than 1 million people made homeless by the Boko Haram militants. South Sudan too remains of key concern. On Thursday, an IGAD summit to resolve the conflict was put off to Saturday. The outstanding issues remain the structure of a proposed transitional government. The other is the political reforms ahead of elections slated for May. Talks have already dragged on for more than a year, with 6 ceasefire agreements failing to hold. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in more than a year of civil war. Africa's relations with the International Criminal Court was also set to be debated. Kenya, whose President Uhuru Kenyatta's crimes against humanity charges were dropped last December, has been lobbying other countries to push for the expansion of the African Court on Human Rights as an alternative to the ICC.
Kenya was the first country to sign the protocol. because again, as we have always said, we believe in African solutions to African problems. We also believe that if we have our own courts, we will have a better way of developing our own judicial infrastructure.
Leaders were also expected to vote on a report by former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo on alternative funding sources for the grouping, as they elected Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe to the AU's one-year rotating chair, replacing Mauritania's President Mohamed Abdelaziz. Jane Keo, CCTV.
Well, there has been criticism that the African Union does not move fast enough or is ineffective when dealing with conflict, terrorism or health emergencies of a large scale. Critics have cited the Boko Haram insurgency, the Ebola and the South Sudanese conflict when making this accusation. CCTV's Girum Chala sought a response from the African Union Commission's Deputy Chair, Erastus Mwencha.
There has been criticism that the African Union does not move fast enough or is ineffective when dealing with conflicts, terrorism or health emergencies of a large scale. The Boko Haram insurgency, Ebola and the South Sudan conflict have been cited by critics when making this accusation. What is your response on this one?
Well, first of all, as an organization, getting criticism is not in itself a bad thing, because it's a message that enables any institution to adjust its instruments, to respond to the stakeholders, and also look at how to manage those expectations. First of all, let me begin by indicating that the African Union itself, as an organization, is now 12 years old. And during this period, it has made tremendous progress in terms of peace and security operations. Since that time, the African Union has been very proactive. In the first instance, it established the African Peace and Security Architecture, which has been really the backbone. This African Peace and Security Architecture has a small working group of 15 member states that meet very regularly. You will be amazed to see how quickly and how often they meet to assess a situation, a crisis, and move there. Beyond that architecture that provides this, the African Union also agreed that increasingly there is need to have capacity to be able to intervene in a crisis. And that was to build what was known as the African Standby Force. In establishing a standby force, it takes time. First of all, you must prepare your doctrines, you must prepare the forces, you must then have them ready in terms of maneuvers, logistics, and equipment. This, of course, takes time. I mean, you still see countries still building the armies. And if you look at what has happened, these standby forces, we now have the Eastern Brigade, you have the Southern Brigade, you have the Western Brigade, you have the Central. It's only the Northern that we don't have a brigade that's being made ready. Now, during the process of preparing the African Standby Force, we faced a number of crises. For instance, when we had the case of Mali, when we had the case of Central African Republic, the African Union was criticized, and rightly so, that the first emergency assistance, help, came from external sources. And that is because we didn't have a rapid response mechanism. And that's why our summit, for instance, last year, decided to set up the African Capacity for Rapid Response Mechanism.
Now, to AU's credit, though there are now less and less violent conflicts in Africa, many countries now hold regular and credible elections, and those who try to take power by the gun have also been made to return it to civilians. Now, how has this success come about, and what does it mean for the African continent?
I think thanks to the leadership and the peoples of the continent. In the first instance, this has been an evolution. Evolution because if you remember, we first of all inherited no democracy from colonial regimes, because they themselves never really practiced democracy, because that's why they subjugated the continent to the kind of colonial rule that there was. And what then emerged from liberation struggles, we had a phase where we were to chart democracy. And unfortunately, during that period, we ended up with the systems that were largely single political parties prevailing all over the continent. But you can see, especially from the 90s and coming to the new millennium, these changes have been taking place. We're having now new constitutional dispensation, which bring in predictable change of government through regular elections, and we are also having rule of law take root. And our role has been to encourage, but you can also see the governments on Africa eager to share best practices. For example, we now have a mechanism known as the African peer review mechanism. This mechanism enables countries, first of all, to be subjected to peer review to see what are the potential causes of challenges from constitution, resource sharing, governance, and all aspects, including resource sharing. And once a country has this, they can go back to their national level and tune their own operations to ensure that they avoid pitfalls of those challenges. And so we are encouraged to see this recognition. But I think this really tribute goes to the people, because if the people themselves give themselves the constitution, and you have strong institutions at the national level, separation of powers, having strong judicial, having strong legislation, having strong executive, in other words, having a strong state, you then guarantee yourself, and the people themselves endow themselves with this attribute.
Well, after the break, my guests on the panel will put some perspective on the issues that took center stage at the 24th Summit of the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Well, Africa's leaders are meeting for the annual African Union Summit. The theme this year is women empowerment, but what exactly is dominating the headlines there at the African Union? Well, joining me to give some perspective to this debate is James Mamboleo. He's a consultant with the International Economic Law Institute. He's joining me here in studio in Nairobi, and in Addis Ababa at the African Union headquarters, Professor David Hoyle, author and scholar. He's been following very closely what's happening at the African Union Summit. Professor Hoyle, I'll start off with you. The theme this year, of course, is women empowerment, but as we know, there are some sideline meetings and other headlines grabbing the agenda there at the African Union. What exactly are Africa's leaders discussing?
Well, of course, as you mentioned, there's a number of issues. The Ebola issue has been quite at the forefront of many of the meetings and much of the discussions. Obviously, a large amount of work is being done all the time, actually, through various of the organs of the AU on that. And of course, also continuing conflicts, DRC, conflicts now, of course, in South Sudan and elsewhere have also been very much in focus. And it's running as a undercurrent, of course, is the International Criminal Court and Africa's approach to that. So several themes, as always.
All right, let's start off with Africa's conflicts here, and in particular the Boko Haram, because Africa's leadership has often been criticized as not having a clear pointer as to how exactly the continent wants to deal with the Boko Haram situation. Are we expecting, though, to see a clearer approach, though, from Africa's leadership now from the summit?
Well, I think, of course, many of these current difficulties. I mean, you've raised the issue of Boko Haram in Nigeria. Many of these new conflicts or conflicts that have really increased in the last few months, a year or so, are themselves, I would say, the result of external interference within Africa. The effects, the side effects of the intervention in Libya, for example, in 2011. Many of the outbreaks of violence that you see now, much of the extremism you now see in the Sahel and sub-Sahel African areas, are the result of that. So once again, Africa is being made to respond. It's having to respond to difficulties actually foisted on them from the outside. It's very difficult to come to terms with a phenomena such as Boko Haram, and I think it will take actually quite some time for Africa, in terms of the African Union, to actually get a program in place. So it's a very difficult issue.
All right, James, your thoughts on that, though, because Africa has been talking about, an approach to Boko Haram for some time now. What are we expecting here?
I don't see much changing in next so many days, because we can't see any specific mechanism that Africa has put in place for specifically dealing with very delicate, complex issues surrounding the whole question of terrorism and Boko Haram in particular. Most of the governments running this part of the world seem completely at sea in terms of what can be done going forward for purposes of dealing with this question. So the latest we checked is Nigeria doesn't know what to do with Boko Haram. They don't seem to tell us exactly what mechanism the government there is putting in place. Africa as a whole doesn't seem to be saying exactly what they would want to see done in terms of Africa and Boko Haram and so on. And so I don't really expect much from Africa soon.
Why is there, though, a seemingly lack of a unified approach, though, when it comes to dealing with this whole question of Boko Haram?
Because of the whole complex question, and which has been the bane of African countries for a long time, called sovereignty. We seem to be saying we need to be left to deal with our own issues, but we don't seem to really get the answer. But at the same time, of course, international instruments, international institutions that could come to the aid of these countries are also going to stand at bay, because the international legal regime, for instance, will not allow any person to go into Nigeria, for instance, and try and help, unless Nigeria has totally failed to do it, or it's unwilling to do it, or calls for help. And we're not seeing Nigeria calling for that kind of help anytime soon. But most importantly, you see a situation in which most of the populations of most African countries are really not working together with their governments. There is a lot of distrust between populations across the African continent with their government on the one side, and then most importantly, there is also a disconnect really between what the government seems to be doing and what the people really want, creating a lot of factions within the polity of these countries. And so therefore there is no unified approach towards any issue, least of all the Boko Haram issue.
All right. Professor Hoyle, just staying with Africa's security challenges for the moment, and the whole question of South Sudan as well is being considered, and we do understand that an IGAD meeting on South Sudan failed to reach a consensus from both sides on certain issues. What is the African Union, though, considering when it comes to South Sudan?
Well, again, this simple fact is, as in the case of Boko Haram, there has to be a national solution to the problems which have actually assisted, in effect, or aided the rise of groups like this and men of violence like this. And I think also within South Sudan, there are very, very distinct structural, institutional difficulties which have given rise to the conflict we have now have now seen. The AU, I think, ultimately it's actually limited in terms of what it can do. What it can do, of course, is actually provide an additional fora within which the various parts of the national picture within South Sudan can be brought together and can hopefully actually discuss and negotiate a peaceful resolution to what are, and I have to say this again, very, very deep structural and in some cases also ethnic issues. So they can act certainly as a facilitator. They can also, of course, in some cases, funnel European Union expertise and European Union resources in conflict mediation and conflict management. The most essential thing, of course, in all these conflicts is dialogue. You have to talk. Violence is not the solution.
All right, James, your thoughts though on South Sudan and that whole impasse at the African Union?
I really don't expect the African Union to provide anything new from what they have always done, which is probably give that extra platform on which this discussion can be held. But in terms of the real force to bring these leaders together and tell them, hey, you know, we have to reach some compromise. It has to be a political solution or whatever other solution. You do not expect to get that much from the African Union for the simple reason that you really need to look at who is in the African Union. Who is it that is going to broker this deal? And that brings you to the inevitable point that, of course, most of the leaders on the African continent have one interest or the other in relation to South Sudan.
But South Sudan did have a breakthrough, though, in the past couple of weeks, signing some agreements, but not completely concluding the deal. They have had, you know, some successes mediated by IGAD.
Of course, but we are looking for that ultimate success in the talks, which will say, now everybody's agreed, let's put in place, for instance, a government that is going to be respected across South Sudan, so that at the end of the day, you really have lasting peace in that country. You see a situation in which people sit down on a table and agree one day, and 3 days later, you can see that the agreement is already busting in the seams, simply because there are certain interests, even within the African continent, that are driving each of these leaders. If the African Union, as the entire membership, could sit down and tell these people, hey, we have to have a solution, then that solution is coming. We have a few things we can do to push you guys to make sure you stick to this agreement, and they can do it. But of course, we're not going to see them do that because, as I said, each African country, each African leader engaged in that discussion has their own interest. All
right. Professor Hall, I'm going to broaden this discussion a little bit and move away from Africa's conflict situation there and to other issues that you mentioned earlier that the African Union is considering. The issue of Ebola, there is going to be an Ebola fund that will be launched at the African Union. What is the African Union, though, considering, and what lessons has it learned from the Ebola crisis of 2014?
Well, I think the AU has, in fact, reacted as fast as one might have expected it to have done. And there's no doubt they saw the crisis emerge. They began work on the issue, the Ebola issue, actually before it was actually declared an international health threat. So in that respect, the AU was actually very fast off the mark. It actually provided significant funds to begin the process of medical outreach to those specific West African countries that were involved. I think they've certainly done a tremendous amount, as much as they could do on this issue. What it also, of course, has done is it's actually brought into being a very, very good debate on the issue of establishing an African Centre for Disease Control. And this, I think, is a tremendously good idea. And I've no doubt that within the coming year or two, maybe shorter than that, such a centre will exist on the African continent, which will be a great improvement. So on the Ebola thing, I don't think you can fault the AU. They've actually done everything they could do.
All right, the AU did a tremendous job during the Ebola crisis in 2014. Your thoughts?
I think this is one of those areas in which the AU and specific member countries of the AU have rendered a lot of support in dealing with the situation. And I think the discussions going on right now about establishing a mechanism to deal with Ebola into the future is a really commendable process. This is something that should be hastened so that deliberately going forward there is a clear mechanism on how to respond to outbreaks of that kind. And not just that one, but scientists should be working and anticipating early enough on what kind of pandemics probably might befall the continent so that we are prepared. So I think this is really a good way forward.
All right. Professor Hall, before I let you go, though, we are receiving reports that the African Union did discuss the International Criminal Court situation and that Africa has described the failed ICC case against Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta as a major victory for the entire continent. What are the sentiments that have been coming out of the African Union in regard with Africa's relationship with the ICC, given that it is always a constant topic there at the African Union?
Yes, it certainly has been. It's been discussed in a whole range of bilateral meetings actually between the various heads of state. It's also been raised within the AU itself. There's a new position statement which is once again actually very questioning of the ICC. Again, actually welcoming, of course, the dropping of the case against the Kenyan president. But you know, it's not just in the bilateral meetings. Everyone you meet within the AU summit, whether they are observers, whether they are delegates, whether they are media. The ICC is an issue which is constantly discussed. It constantly comes up. And the overwhelming consensus I've come across is that the actual hostility to the ICC is not lessening. I think it's increasing. And you know, the ending of the case against President Kenyatta, I think, has actually vindicated many of the views that had already existed about the ICC.
All right, Professor David Hall joining us there from the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Author and scholar, I do thank you very much for your sentiments and input on the program. James, before I let you go, I want to get your final assessment. You have the final word on this. Over a decade later since the rebranding of the Organization of African Unity into the African Unity, where can we say that the African Union is succeeding and what remain its challenges?
We are saying year in, year out that we should do something as a continent. And the African Union, for instance, has said we are going to be that platform in which we are going to encourage our membership to do certain things for purposes of taking us where we are supposed to go. But most importantly, the challenges that are core to the existence of the African population still continue unabated. It is not possible at this point to say that the African Union has gotten its act together. So in my view, the challenges will continue being there since we cannot see any proper mechanism either coming from the AU membership in general or its specific members in relation to dealing with each of these activities. I think that is the biggest challenge that we may have going forward in 2015.
All right, James Mamboleo, we'll leave it there for the moment. Consultant with the International Economic Law Center joining us here on Talk Africa. Thank you very much for your insights. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. This has been Talk Africa. Goodbye.